The night of June 21, 1941, was a masterpiece of deception. Along a frontier that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the air was unnervingly still. In the tall grass of the borderlands, millions of German soldiers lay in wait, their breath visible in the cool night air, their hands gripping the cold steel of Mauser rifles. Behind them, the greatest mechanical monster ever assembled 3 million men. 3,000 tanks and 7,000 artillery pieces sat in a state of coiled, predatory silence. The German war machine was a clock wound to the point of breaking, waiting for the tick of 3:15. But across the river, the Soviet Union was sleeping. Not the sleep of the peaceful, but the sleep of the drugged. The border guards had been ordered not to provoke the Germans. The pilots were forbidden from overflying the frontier. The ammunition was locked away. The Soviet giant was lying exposed on the operating table, and the man who had placed it there was sitting alone in the Kremlin, convinced that he was the only one who truly understood the game. Joseph Stalin was a man defined by a paranoia that bordered on the supernatural. He had purged his own generals, executed his own friends, and lived in a constant state of suspicion that everyone, from his dry cleaner to his closest advisors, was a traitor, yet in a paradox that would haunt history for a century. The most suspicious man on earth decided to trust the one man who had promised to destroy him, Adolf Hitler. Stalin viewed himself as the ultimate realist, a grand master of geopolitics. He believed that Hitler was too rational to start a two-front war, that the German build-up on the border was merely a provocation designed to extort concessions. 2. Stalin, the intelligence reports piling up on his desk weren't warnings. They were an elaborate British plot to trick Russia into a war with Germany. He sat in the flickering light of his office, his pipe smoke swirling like the ghosts of the millions he had already killed, and began to sharpen his red pencil. The reports were undeniable. Richard Sorge, the legendary Soviet spy in Tokyo, had sent the exact date of the invasion. War will begin on June 22nd, he warned. From London, Winston Churchill sent a personal warning detailing the movement of German panzer divisions. Stalin dismissed it as British disinformation. Even as German deserters swam across the Bug River on the night of June 21st, shouting that the attack was coming at dawn, Stalin ordered them shot as provocateurs. He had built a psychological fortress around himself, a world where reality was only what he said it was. He had spent years breaking the will of the Russian people, and now he had broken his own ability to see the truth. The man of steel was about to meet a wall of iron, and he was the only one in Moscow who couldn't hear the engines starting. In the final hours of June 21st, the German build-up reached a fever pitch. In the forests of Poland and East Prussia, the silence was replaced by the low, guttural growl of thousands of engines being warmed. The scent of gasoline and grease hung heavy in the air, mixing with the smell of the damp earth. The German soldiers checked their watches, the glow of their cigarettes the only light in the dark. They were told the Russians were subhuman, a colossus with feet of clay. They were told that one kick to the door would bring the pillow whole house down. And as they looked across the river at the dark, silent Soviet landscape, they saw no lights, no movement, no defense. They saw a country that had been blinded by its own master. The ultimate irony occurred at 2 a.m., just 90 minutes before the world would explode. A Soviet freight train, laden with grain, oil, and manganese, rumbled across the bridge and into German-occupied territory. It was part of the trade agreement Stalin had meticulously maintained to keep Hitler happy. The very supplies that would fuel the German invasion were being delivered by the victims themselves. Stalin had ensured that the German army was well-fed and well-fueled for the conquest of Russia. It was the final act of a tragic comedy. In 90 minutes, those same tracks would carry German armored trains in the opposite direction. Stalin went to bed that night in his dacha, a man at the height of his power, secure in his brilliant diplomacy. He didn't know that the morning sun would bring not a new day, but the end of the world, as he knew it. At 3:15 a.m., the silence of the European continent didn't just end, it was vaporized. 3 million German soldiers moved as one, a grey-clad tide of iron that poured across 1,000 miles of frontier. This was not a battle, it was a mechanical slaughter. Along the Bug and the Niemen rivers, the Soviet border guardsmen, who had been told until their final breath that war was an impossibility, were erased from history in a heartbeat. They died in their watchtowers, still holding binoculars. They died in their bunks, buried under the rubble of barracks that had been targeted with surgical precision. The sound of the barrage was so loud it was heard in the suburbs of Moscow. 700 miles away, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the earth that felt like the heartbeat of a dying giant. But in the Kremlin, the state-of-the-art communication hub of the Soviet Union, there was only silence. The German Brandenburger saboteurs had done their work well, cutting the telegraph lines and destroying the radio towers in the first minutes of the assault. The Soviet Union was no longer a nation. It was a collection of isolated islands, each being swallowed by the iron tide. Unable to scream for help, as the sun began to rise over the burning fields of Belarus and Ukraine, the full scale of Stalin's blindness was revealed in the wreckage of the Red Air Force, because Stalin had forbidden his commanders from moving their aircraft to camouflaged satellite fields, fearing that such a move would provoke Hitler. Over 1,200 Soviet planes were caught like sitting ducks on the tarmac. German pilots recalled it as target practice. They flew so low they could see the faces of the Soviet mechanics running toward the burning hangars. In just 4 hours, the largest air force in the world was rendered non-existent. The Soviet soldiers on the ground looked up, expecting to see their own red falcons protecting them, but they saw only the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and burning rubber, the scent of a modernization effort that had been decapitated by the ego of one man. The first frantic reports reached Moscow within 30 minutes, but they were met with a terrifying bureaucratic paralysis. No one dared to wake Stalin. In the Soviet Union, to bring bad news was a death sentence. To bring news that contradicted Stalin's genius was a form of suicide. Finally, at 4 a.m., General Georgy Zhukov, the chief of the General Staff, picked up the VCHK secure line to Stalin's dacha at Kuntsivo. He spoke to the duty officer, his voice trembling. "Wake him," Zhukov ordered. "The Germans are bombing our cities." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The duty officer knew that waking the man of steel was such news could be his final act. When Stalin finally came to the phone, his voice was thick with sleep and irritation. Zhukov delivered the news. Sevastopol, Kiev, and Minsk were under fire. Stalin didn't scream. He didn't issue orders. He simply breathed into the receiver a heavy, rhythmic sound that Zhukov later described as the most frightening thing he had ever heard. The master of the Soviet world was experiencing the one thing he had never allowed himself to feel: total, disorienting shock. By 5:45 a.m., Stalin arrived at the Kremlin. Those who saw him that morning would never forget the transformation. The man who usually dominated every room with a single look was now a ghost. His face was a sallow grey, his mustache twitched, and he walked with the hesitant step of an old man. He gathered his inner circle in his office, but he seemed unable to comprehend the maps being laid before him. He kept returning to the same refrain. It must be a provocation by the German generals. Hitler cannot know about this. He was still trying to save his delusion. He ordered his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, to meet with the German ambassador, Count von der Schulenburg. Stalin still believed that this was a diplomatic crisis, a misunderstanding that could be solved with a few more concessions of grain and oil. He refused to believe that the man he had trusted had already decided to wipe him from the face of the earth. The meeting with the German ambassador lasted only minutes, but it was the final nail in the coffin of Stalin's foreign policy. Schulenburg, a man of the old school who personally loathed the war he was forced to declare, read the formal statement from Berlin. Germany was going to war to protect Europe from the Bolshevik threat. Molotov, the man who had signed the pact with Ribbentrop just 2 years earlier, was stunned. He looked at the ambassador and asked a question that was as pathetic as it was revealing. "Do you really believe we deserved this?" When Molotov returned to Stalin's office with the formal declaration of war, Stalin finally collapsed. He sank into his chair, his pipe falling to the desk. He realized that he had been the world's greatest fool. He had spent years purging his own army to prevent a coup, and in doing so, he had invited an invasion he was now powerless to stop. The man of steel had turned to lead, and as the reports of the total collapse of the front began to pour in, Joseph Stalin did the one thing no one expected. He vanished. For the next several days, the Soviet Union had no leader. Stalin retreated to his dacha, shut the doors, and refused to see anyone. He spent his hours staring at the trees, convinced that his own people or his own advisors would arrive any minute to arrest him for his failure. He was waiting for the executioner's knock that he had delivered to so many others. While the Red Army was being surrounded in massive kettles, with hundreds of thousands of men being marched into German captivity, the man responsible for the defense of Russia was hiding in a dark room, paralyzed by his own shame and fear. He had been blinded by his ego, and now 200 million people were paying the price for his sightless ambition. The Iron Storm was here, and the only man who could stop it had decided to let the world burn. By the end of June 1941, the Soviet Union was a body without a head. The front lines had dissolved into a series of massive kettles, or pockets, where hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were being encircled and devoured by the German panzers. In the Minsk pocket alone, over 300,000 men were lost captured, killed, or simply vanished into the chaos. The roads of Western Russia were clogged with a new, bitter harvest, a line of prisoners that stretched for miles, men who had been promised a glorious defense and were instead given a ticket to a German labor camp. And while the heart of the Russian military was being torn out, the man who had ordered them to stay put was nowhere to be found. Joseph Stalin remained locked inside, his dacha at Koncevo, a prisoner of his own monumental failure. He had spent 8 days in a state of near catatonic depression. convinced that the history he had tried to write was now being rewritten by Hitler's tanks. He was a man waiting for the end, certain that his own advisors, the men he had terrified for decades, would finally arrive not to take orders, but to take his life. On June 30th, the silence was finally broken. The Politburo, the inner circle of the Soviet government, made a choice that defied the logic of the regime. They decided to visit Stalin. They arrived at the Kuntsevo dacha not with an execution squad, but with a plea. When they entered Stalin's private study, they found a man who had completely collapsed. He was unwashed, his clothes were rumpled, and his eyes were hollow. When he saw them, he visibly flinched. He stood up slowly, his back against the wall, and famously asked, "Why? Have you come?" In his mind, this was the coup. This was the moment his crimes caught up with him. But Molotov stepped forward and did the unthinkable. He offered Stalin his power back. They didn't want to kill him. They were too terrified to lead without him. They needed the symbol of the man of steel to keep the country from disintegrating. Stalin looked at their faces, realized he was safe, and in a heartbeat the ghost vanished. The tyrant was reborn. He didn't thank them. He simply walked past them, out of the dacha and toward the Kremlin. The blindness was over. The murderous cleric had begun. July 3rd, 1941. The people of the Soviet Union gathered around every available loudspeaker in the country and factories, on street corners, and in the ruins of bombed-out villages. For 11 days they had heard nothing from their leader. Now, a voice crackled through the static. It was Stalin, but it was a Stalin they had never heard before. His voice was thin and trembling. Listeners could hear the distinct clink of a water glass against his teeth and his heavy, labored breathing. He didn't start with the usual communist slogans. He began with 3 words that shocked the nation. Brothers and sisters. He was no longer the infallible leader of the proletariat. He was a frightened man appealing to the soul of Russia. He spoke of sacred war. He called for a scorched earth policy, demanding that nothing, not a single pound of grain, not a single liter of fuel be left for the fascist curs. He was humanizing the monster to save the state. The address was a psychological masterpiece. It signaled to the Russian people that the time for politics was over. The time for survival had arrived. As Stalin returned to the Kremlin, his clarity manifested in the most brutal way possible. He realized that the Red Army was retreating in panic, and his solution was not better strategy, but more terror. He issued Order No. 270, and later the infamous Order No. 227. Not a step back. He declared that any commander who retreated without a written order was a traitor. Any soldier who was captured was a criminal, and their families back home were to be arrested or denied food rations. To enforce this, he created barrier troops, NKVD units, positioned behind the front lines with machine guns, ordered to shoot any Soviet soldier who turned back from the German fire. Stalin was fighting 2 wars, one against Hitler and one against his own people's fear. He was no longer blind to the German threat. He was now obsessed with it, and he was willing to burn every village and execute every retreating soldier. To buy himself one more day of time, the policy of scorched earth was implemented with a fanatical devotion. As the Red Army retreated, they destroyed everything. They blew up the Great Dnieper Dam, a jewel of Soviet industry. They burned millions of tons of wheat while their own people starved. They poisoned wells and dismantled factories, shipping the machinery on thousands of trains to the Ural Mountains. Stalin was treating the Soviet Union like a fortress under siege, and the Russian people were merely the fuel for the furnace. The blindness of June 22nd had been replaced by a vision of total destruction. He understood now that Hitler didn't want a treaty. He wanted an end to the Slavic race. Stalin's response was to turn Russia into a wasteland where the only thing that the Germans would find was hunger and cold. By October, the Iron Storm had reached the very gates of Moscow. From the rooftops of the Kremlin, Soviet observers could see the flashes of German field guns. The government was evacuated to Kuybyshev, but Stalin, in a final act of calculated defiance, stayed. He realized that if he fled, the symbol of the Soviet state would vanish forever. He remained in his office, working 20 hours a day, moving pins on a map that showed the enemy just 15 miles from his door. The man who had been too blind to see the invasion was now staring directly into the muzzle of the German army. He had lost the first round of the war through ego and denial, but he was prepared to win the second round with the lives of 20 million people. The great blindness had cost Russia its soul. Now, the great sacrifice was about to begin. By the winter of 1941, the world's most terrifying gamble was entering its endgame. The German panzers were so close to Moscow that German officers could see the golden domes of the Kremlin through their artillery periscopes. The Iron Storm had reached its high-water mark, but the colossus with feet of clay that Hitler had predicted had not fallen. Instead, it had hardened. Stalin, the man who had been paralyzed by denial in June, was now a man obsessed with the minutiae of battle. He stayed in the city, even as the sound of German machine guns echoed in the suburbs. On November 7th, he did the unthinkable. He held a military parade in Red Square. In the middle of a blizzard, while the Luftwaffe circled overhead, Soviet troops marched straight from the parade ground to the front lines, 15 miles away. It was a calculated, theatrical act of defiance. Stalin realized that his people didn't need a politician. They needed a martyr king. He gave them the image of a leader who would rather be buried in the ruins of Moscow than retreat. The blindness of the summer had been replaced by a frozen, murderous clarity. He would save the city, not with brilliant strategy, but by burying the German army under a mountain of Russian bodies. The war of denial evolved into the war of attrition. At Stalingrad, the industrial heart of the Volga, the blindness of one man's ego met the madness of another's. For 5 months, the city was turned into a landscape of broken brick and charred bone. Stalin issued the final evolution of his not a step back doctrine. To him, the city that bore his name was more than a strategic point. It was the physical manifestation of his will. He poured entire armies into the ruins, knowing that the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. He watched the casualty reports not with grief, but with a cold, mathematical detachment. He realized that the German army was a precision instrument that could not survive of blunt force trauma. Every Soviet death was a grain of sand in the gears of the German machine. By the time the German Sixth Army surrendered in the frozen craters of the city, the tide of the war had shifted forever. The man who had almost destroyed Russia through his silence was now the man who had saved it through his ruthlessness. But the ledger of his victory was being written in numbers that defied human comprehension. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the victory was hollowed out by a terrifying statistic. For decades, the Soviet government had met to 7 million dead, then 20 million. Today, Historians believe the number is closer to 27 million. It is a figure so large it loses its meaning. It is the population of an entire nation erased in 4 years. As Stalin sat in the Kremlin after the war, receiving the adulation of a grateful world, he knew the truth that he would never admit to the public. At least half of those deaths were unnecessary. If he had listened to Richard Sorge in Tokyo, if he had trusted Churchill's intelligence, if he hadn't decapitated his own officer corps in the purges of 1937, the Iron Storm might have been stopped at the border. The Great Blindness was not just a mistake. It was a crime of ego that had turned the soil of Russia into a massive continental cemetery. Stalin didn't feel remorse. He viewed the dead as the necessary price for his own survival. He had turned his greatest failure into his greatest legend, using the blood of 20 million people to wash away the shame of June 22nd. The end came for Stalin in 1953. In the same dacha where he had hidden during the first days of the invasion. He died as he had lived, in a world of silence and fear. His guards were too terrified to enter his room when they heard him fall, just as his generals had been too terrified to wake him when the bombs fell on Kiev. In his final hours, he was alone with the ghosts of the millions he had sent to the front without rifles, the men he had ordered to be shot for retreating, and the families he had destroyed in the name of a loyalty he himself never possessed. The man of steel had outlived Hitler, he had outlived Roosevelt, and he had built an empire that spanned half the globe. But his legacy remained rooted in that single, catastrophic failure of vision. He had been the master of the Soviet world, but he had been a slave to his own certainty. History has a long memory, and the great blindness of Joseph Stalin serves as the ultimate warning for the modern age. It is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in a leader's arsenal is not the missile or the tank, but the refusal to see the world as it actually is. Stalin's blindness cost 20 million lives, but it also proved a darker truth, that, in the hands of a tyrant, even a catastrophic failure can be forged into a crown of victory. We remember the victory of 1945, but we must never forget the silence of June 1941, because the cost of a leader's ego is always paid in the currency of the innocent. And in the forests of the Eastern Front, the trees are still growing over. The bones of men who died because one man in a dark room decided that the truth was a provocation.